All right. Well, thank you so much to Elżbieta for inviting me. Thank you to all of you for coming. I'm really very happy to be here. I'm happy to be in this space in particular and to see so many people I know. And I'm so happy that Krzysztof just arrived from Poland. I actually wrote this book at Krzysztof's place in Krasnogruda at the Borderlands Foundation in Poland over the course of 3 different summers. And the book is in some sense very connected to Krasnogruda, as is my thinking. Okay. I always try to kind of look around the audience and think like, what will they be interested in hearing about, and adjust accordingly. So I'm going to talk today about, a revolution that was not my own and a book I never intended to write, which is a slightly strange position to be in. In some sense, a book I specifically intended not to write because I thought for all sorts of reasons, I didn't have the right to write it. But I ended up writing it anyway and feeling enormously grateful that I did, and enormously grateful to my editor who talked me into writing the book. And I had a lot of doubts. And at a certain point in the middle of it, I realized that this was exactly the thing I needed to be doing, for better or for worse. So because I'm at the New School, I'm going to talk maybe a little more about philosophy and revolution than I might have with a more public audience, because those of you who I know here, are interested in that part of it. So let me start with Eastern Europe. So 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. November 1989, I was a senior in high school. I was just at that moment recovering slowly and not very well from the suicide of Abby Hoffman in April 1989. Those 2 events in my biography are connected. The symbolic end of 1968, then the counterculture and the protest movements in America with the giving up of Abby Hoffman, who was my great hero. And then the kind of miraculous fall of the Berlin Wall, and I remember where I was when I heard that the Berlin Wall fell. It was this kind of seminal moment in my life. As a kind of aside, I just found a book, actually thanks to a friend of your father's at Berkeley, by a novelist named Anne Nesbeth, who wrote a book set in East Berlin right before the fall of the wall for children. And I had been searching for something I could read to my children to give them a sense of what the communist experience is about. It's called Cloud and Wallfish, or maybe Wallfish and Cloud. In any case, if anyone is looking for a children's novel, it's probably aimed at like 10 to 14-year-olds. I read it with my 7-year-old. This was really excellent. The kind of the moral complexity, that the looming presence of the wall, what it meant to be on one side of the wall or on the other side of the wall. I looked with my kids, my 5-year-old and 7-year-old are both German speaking, and I was watching the footage of the fall of the Berlin Wall with them, and trying to explain to them what was happening, which of course they couldn't entirely understand. And it brought back the extraordinary drama of the moment, the way the people who were experiencing it never thought they would live to see that. And that idea of people experiencing something that they never thought they would live to see. And that moment of how do people react to some kind of extraordinary experience that they had never anticipated becomes a theme in kind of my vicarious experiencing of the Maidan, and in my attempt to understand how other people experience the Maidan. So at that time, after the Berlin Wall fell, when I knew nothing about, Eastern Europe, I was, reading what was being translated into English. I was caught up by, the great Czech slogan, "The truth will prevail." Some of you have heard the story that the first word I learned in any Slavic language was pravda, was truth. And I learned it first in Czech. And I was just struck by how the Czech and Slovak dissidents I was talking to, they used it like as if it were something solid, as if it were like, your keys or a pen, or you could pick it up and you could hold it and you could put it in your pocket. And that was the beginning of my kind of romance with Eastern Europe and how I was kind of pulled into it, this idea of the philosophy of truth, and what did it mean that anybody kind of still believed in truth, and this age that seemed to me, as I was coming of age, to be very cynical in comparison to how I imagined Abby Hoffman's great age and my self-pity for the fact that I had missed it. And then in February 1990, as some of you will remember, Václav Havel is the imprisoned playwright, who and the human rights activist who then, becomes the leader of the revolution and gets elected first post-communist president of Czechoslovakia and gets to live in this very beautiful castle overlooking the river. He then comes in February 1990, just like 6 weeks after he becomes president, to Washington, and he gives a speech before the joint session of the American Congress, and he says, consciousness precedes being, not the other way around, as the Marxists claim. I had no idea what it meant at the time. I mean, I was probably a decade or two away from figuring out what it meant. And I think almost nobody listening knew what it meant. I mean, it's a reference to the moment in German ideology where Marx and Engels talk about, being precedes consciousness. Your consciousness for Marx was the kind of derivative of your objective position in the socioeconomic order. And Havel's statement, consciousness precedes being, which went totally misunderstood, although everybody thought it sounded extremely beautiful, was an affirmation of responsibility. And it was an affirmation of a subjectivity of a self that carried responsibility that was prior to and transcendent of any kind of socioeconomic or political condition. The self comes first. And I later came to understand that, this was very close to what Adam Michnik meant when he talked about as if. To live as if, for Adam is you live as if you were a free person. That means you bear responsibility for your choices, regardless of any kind of constraints, regardless of the situation. Responsibility that was transcendent of conditions. And this was how I would eventually, years later, come to this philosophy project, because through Havel, I started reading Jan Patočka, and through Patočka, I started reading Heidegger, and through Heidegger, I started reading Husserl. For all of the philosophers and intellectual historians out there, there's a totally bizarre order in which to read people. Was some kind of regression. But that's when I understood that the source of this particular philosophy of dissent came largely from this phenomenological turned existentialist tradition, which is the subject of the present book from which I got distracted by the Ukrainian Revolution. The short version of that story, of the story about phenomenology, was a kind of attempt to ground objectivity and subjectivity. And Husserl was, Husserl, Jay Bernstein isn't here, who has listened to me try to work through all my angst about Husserl, as has James. Husserl had this idea that you can have it all. You can have, full objectivity and full subjectivity. Which, in Polish, you would say this was a dancing at two weddings problem. You can't dance at two weddings at once. You kind of can't have your cake and eat it too. But Husserl wanted everything. He was the Obama figure. He was the yes, we can. Yes, the subject can reach the object because consciousness is not enclosed in a box. The structure of consciousness is intentionality. It's always reaching out to grab that object and and in the beginning is the relationship. The relationship precedes the parts. So from this idea of subjectivity, the subjectivity that is kind of always already related to the object, and then Heidegger comes along and he radicalizes this and says, well, there's not really any distance between subject and object because we're always already in the world. You get a philosophy of dissent slowly through various kind of permutations and discussions that's very concerned with subjectivity. It means assert subjectivity. Against this kind of Marxism, Hegelianism that seemed to reduce the subject essentially to an object, in which the goal was, if you were an intellectual, to kind of, excise traces of your subjectivity that were not perfectly identical with the objective laws of history. And eventually it's going to be that tradition. It's going to be Heidegger who approaches as kind of the antidote to Hegel, the way that you get out of Hegel. But to bring this back to dissent, this idea of subjectivity, of podmiotovost, was something that Solidarity was talking about, was something that I came across, reading Jacek Koron and reading Adam Michnik and reading the young Kostek Gebert and reading Jan Gross. From that, there was that moment, in the late 70s and the early 80s, where there was a feeling that, okay, we've done it. There's no longer left and there's no longer right. Those categories don't have meaning anymore. Now this is about subjectivity. This is about our individual subjectivity. It's about society subjectivity. It's about taking responsibility. It's being a full self. And the famous Greengrocer essay that, is a result of Havel and Adam Michnik's famous meeting on this mountain. As years go by, I find it ever more extraordinary that they both managed to climb that mountain. Like, the more I think about that, the more I read, like, neither one of them seem like the mountain climbing types to me. But they climbed this mountain, and as a result of that initial encounter, and kind of at Adam Michnik's request, Havel writes the famous essay, The Power of the Powerless, which is dedicated to the memory of Jan Patočka, in which the greengrocer, who goes to his shop every morning and in the window alongside the carrots and onions puts the sign that says, "Workers of the world unite." And Havel says, why does he put it there? Is it part of his sincere, spontaneous desire to acquaint the world with his socialist consciousness? Havel says, no, of course not. He doesn't believe the sign. The customers don't believe the sign. Even the regime doesn't believe the sign. Moreover, the regime knows that the people don't believe it, and they know that the regime knows that they know, and everybody knows that everybody knows, but nevertheless, they go on pretending. And Havel is going to say that the greengrocer is living a lie. He's living an inauthentic existence. In Sartre's terms, he's living in bad faith, in the sense of self-deception, but not self-deception about his belief in communism. He knows perfectly well he doesn't believe in communism. He lives in self-deception about his powerlessness, because Havel says the greengrocer is not so powerless after all. In fact, it's the greengrocers who allow the game to go on in the first place. And the greengrocer deceives himself, about his subjectivity, about his agency, and about his responsibility. He is therefore responsible and he is therefore guilty. Okay. Let me maybe throw out, a couple more references, as I kind of read back into that tradition. In the case of Czechoslovakia, I found that the key moment, when the intellectuals started to extricate themselves from Stalinism and from Stalinist discourse, and they had a very hard time doing this, even after Khrushchev's. They initially literally had no other language with which to critique Stalinism, Stalinist language. And when they did find a language, one of the fundamental categories they started to juxtapose was the people and people, plural of person. This is clear in Slavic languages that it is in English. In Czech, there's lid. In Polish, it would be lud, which is like the people with the article as a kind of singular collective, uncountable. And then there's lida, which would be ludzi, which would be, people as in plural of persons, humans, right? And the key moment, what Foucault would call that archaeological shift, is when you go from the singular collective to actually as a collection of individual persons. And this is one of the things that, Adam Michnik writes very movingly about Jacek Kuron after his death. And he says, Jacek loved concrete people. He didn't love the people as such. He loved concrete people. He believed in concrete people. And he believed in each person taking responsibility for himself. There was that famous slogan of, don't burn down the committees, build your own. Yeah. Don't. Right. Yes. So don't destroy the ones that exist. You build your own. And so that was this kind of remarkable romantic to me ethic, and then comes 1989 and communism falls and the Wicked Witch is dead and, everyone seems like they're going to live happily ever after. But as George Orwell likes to say, every revolution is a failure in its own way, and the way that these ones seem to be a failure, despite the fairy tale nature of the fall of the Iron Curtain, was in the loss of these kinds of values. And this was kind of the obsessive topic of the conversations between Havel and Michnik at Havel's death, and Elżbieta edited this wonderful collection of them in English translation. So those of you who don't speak the right languages can read them all in English from Elżbieta. But one of the things that, Havel until the end of his life, obsessed about was we've lost the values, that were most important to us. And that dissent wasn't some kind of anti-communist position in favor of Western liberalism, that, dissent was an existential attitude. Dissent was a decision to live in responsibility, to live in truth, to live as if you were a free person. And now suddenly communism falls and the Iron Curtain falls and you have consumer culture. There's a lot of, you could feel they're kind of disgust at just the tawdriness of it all. Adam was talking about how now people care more about their checkbooks, but they used to stand in line overnight to read real books, and people used to stay up every night copying poems by hand. Now nobody cares about poetry, and nobody cares about reading. Havel felt like, we've just kind of fallen now into this kind of inauthentic consumer culture. We don't have a new generation yet which is creating new values. And rather than thinking seriously about values, there was this kind of substitution of accounting with the past, of lustration, of historical policy, of externalizing guilt, of telling yourself a story in which everything bad that ever happened to you happened because of somebody else. In some sense, both lustration and historical policy, which is back in the news again, Elżbieta and I were just talking about this, was about this idea that everything bad that happened comes from the outside, and therefore you can kind of purify yourself. And it's a way of evading responsibility. It's a way of displacing responsibility. And it's also a kind of attempt to find a safe place in the world, which, alas, does not exist. And so Adam was mourning about the fact to Havel that we're now in an axiological vacuum. We don't have values anymore. And Havel is saying, we need an existential revolution. And Adam is saying, this is a civilization that needs metaphysics. And then right before the Maidan, the philosopher Marcin Shore, who is a student of Kołakowski's, comes out with this kind of scathingly self-critical book. I see somebody knows him. Basically saying we were stupid, like we screwed up. And he gives this long interview to Gazeta Wyborcza. And the journalist says, well, what's wrong? And he says, okay, we have a non-trivial economic crisis. We have a serious political crisis. And we have a potentially fatal spiritual crisis. The journalist is like, okay, what is the fatal spiritual crisis? And Marcin says, well, we've stopped asking ourselves questions. And the journalist says, what kind of? And Marcin says, well, metaphysical questions. We've stopped asking ourselves, where evil comes from. And what struck me about the Maidan, and the reason why I found myself unable to turn away from it, despite my general resolution never to write in real time and not to write about current politics, is that this was the return of metaphysics. This was in some sense the return of a conversation that felt familiar to me. It felt nostalgic, but not antiquated. It felt essential. And it had somehow unexpectedly, when nobody was waiting for it anymore, it had somehow come back. Suddenly these ideas about, good and evil and what it meant to be a full human subject, and what it meant to live in truth. Suddenly that came back. Suddenly that was a serious discussion again. So I'll only really very quickly go through the Ukrainian Revolution because I think this is a crowd that probably really knows what happened in the Ukrainian Revolution. No. Okay.
I wanted to say there are people interested here in Ukrainian.
Right, but okay, I'll tell you the story briefly. So as most of you probably know, in 2004, there was this presidential election in Ukraine between this hoodlum turned gangster turned oligarch guy, Viktor Yanukovych, who was the Kremlin's favored candidate, and another Viktor Yushchenko, who seemed to be, the more refined, elegant, Western-looking, pro-European candidate. And the short version of that story is that as a result of election fraud and an attempt to poison Yushchenko with dioxin, Yanukovych was declared the winner. And at this point, Ukrainians went out onto the street. They went to the Maidan, which is the big square in the center of Kiev. It's important to the story for those of you who haven't been to Kiev. It's a really big square. It's a big square. It's a complex public space. It's kind of multi-leveled. And it's at the end of a long shopping boulevard, which is huge. And there's a kind of underground shopping mall under part of it. You can do a lot with a space that's kind of that sophisticated. But anyway, people go out in 2004. Ukrainians go out into the streets. They stand there for 3 weeks. They protest, they freeze, and they win. The elections are done over. Yushchenko wins. It seems like there's a happy ending, and everybody goes home. And then we go back to Orwell's "Every revolution is a failure in its own way." And Yushchenko did not turn out to be, the good Tsar that everybody had been hoping for. Whether because he was never as great as people thought, or because he never recovered completely from the dioxin poisoning, or because of infighting among his team, or because of his, turned pathological relationship with Yulia Tymoshenko, or for overdetermined reasons, it doesn't go well. And people are disillusioned. And Yanukovych, who, it seems like I could not have believed in 2004 he could ever come back. I mean, he just seemed like so nakedly, unapologetically a gangster back in 2004. And he so nakedly had Yushchenko poisoned, and Yushchenko's whole face is disfigured, and it was this kind of grotesque mafia thing. And you wouldn't think they would ever take him back. But it turns out that here in this country, we have this little niche market of specialists, a boutique industry of people who do PR for gangsters with presidential ambitions. So this guy named Paul Manafort goes over to Ukraine, doesn't know Ukrainian, doesn't know Russian, doesn't matter. He gives Yanukovych a makeover. He kind of coaches him on his hair and his clothes and his tie, or to me, he still seemed kind of nakedly, unapologetically like a gangster, but the makeover worked. And in 2010, he's legitimately elected the president. And no one I've talked to disputes that this time he legitimately wins the election. Maybe as another aside, I'll tell the story that the day after our own presidential elections a year and a half ago, Wednesday morning, when I was lying on the floor of my office at Yale, throwing up into a plastic bag, the first person who called me was Slava Varkarchuk, the Ukrainian rock star. And he said, "Marci, it's Slava. I'm calling from Kiev. And I just want to give you my moral support and tell you that I think I know how you feel." This was kind of how I felt in 2010 when I realized that we actually voted for Yanukovych. And then he said, maybe this is something that societies have to go through and learn from their mistakes. Finally, he's like, "Marci, please get off the floor. You have beautiful children." I eventually got off the floor. In any case, Yanukovych comes back. He's nakedly, unapologetically a gangster. That's his thing, slightly more elegant after his makeover by Manafort. But he is, despite, his gangsterness, ostensibly leading Ukraine on this pro-European course towards, eventual association or integration into the European Union. In 2013, he is set to sign this association agreement on behalf of Ukraine with the European Union, which is not like an astoundingly great agreement. I mean, it would have involved Ukraine incurring high costs to enact the necessary reforms. It likely would have provoked retaliation from the Kremlin. It promised at the end of the day no eventual EU membership, but it was a step, it was a symbol, it was a foot in the door, it was a sign that Ukraine was heading towards Europe and that Europe was potentially, ready to receive Ukraine. And for young people, I think it was huge. I mean, it would mean whether or not Europe was going to be open to you. Could you go on Erasmus exchanges? Could you do internships in Brussels? Would you have a chance to learn English or French or German or whatever you wanted to learn? Would you have a chance to have a multinational career? Would you be able to travel, to conferences or on vacation or to visit your friends without spending months humiliating yourselves standing in line and grappling with the bureaucracy to get a visa? And for those young people especially, when Yanukovych on November 21st, 2013 just suddenly said, no, I'm not going to sign it, it was like their future had suddenly been stolen. from them. And abruptly, the ceremony had already been prepared. The pens were laid out in Vilnius, and he just decided the last minute, I'm not going to sign it. And nothing might have happened then, had not this, 32-year-old Afghan-Ukrainian journalist named Mustafa Naim posted in Russian on Facebook a message saying, hey, if you are really upset, come out to the Maidan by midnight tonight. Likes do not count. And interestingly, that sentence often got mistranslated into English in the coverage, which I find interesting because Isaac will appreciate this. It's one of those precious, rare moments when the Russian translates perfectly into English. Like that almost never happens when you're translating, but it's actually liking the italicized. It's literally likes do not count, which struck me as a remarkable sentence because it's a sentence that 15 years earlier would have been meaningless. It's a sentence that would have meant nothing before Facebook, and suddenly it becomes a revolutionary slogan for the 21st century, likes do not count. And people come out, students come out. Zhenya was there the first night. And, they're not interested in being represented by opposition political parties. They're not interested in language politics. They're not interested in ethnic politics. They call themselves Euromaidan, and they're just saying Ukraine is Europe. That's it. Ukraine is Europe. And they're there, a couple hundred to several hundred of them for the next 9 days, day and night, and they're singing and there's dancing and there's holding hands and it's very peaceful. And then Yanukovych, for whatever reason, and I don't profess to have any special epistemological access to what was going on inside his soul, he decides, on November 30th in the middle of the night, that he's going to end this. He's going to send out Berkut, who are his stormtrooper riot police guys with the big helmets and the huge shields, to brutally beat up the students. And presumably then the parents are going to come drag their kids off the streets. And this is when the really remarkable thing happens. And for me as a historian, this was an incredible moment because it was like the Aufhebung of a century and a half of Oedipal rebellion. I mean, you could plot the whole history of communism. You could plot the whole history of liberalism and the failure of liberalism and the various generations from communism as a history of each generation in turn rising up against the fathers. And certainly, that was very much true in 1968, which we're commemorating right now. The people that, are common friends, they were out there demonstrating against the system that their parents built, very consciously. And in Germany, they were out there demonstrating against the silences and complicities of their parents. And so suddenly they beat up the kids. Yanukovych brutally beats up the kids. He's expecting the parents to pull their kids off the streets. And that's when this extraordinary thing happens, because instead of pulling their kids off the streets, the parents join them there. And I was completely captivated by this. As someone who has long been interested in the variable of generations and generational identity, the idea that suddenly the parents were coming out and the grandparents were coming out, and now they were saying, we will not let you beat our children. And I noticed that even people who didn't have children themselves were saying, it is not permitted. We will not let you beat our children. And so suddenly from a few hundred people, the next day, 24 hours later, you have close to 1 million people on the streets of Kiev. And no one has ever seen so many people on the streets of Kiev. One of the people I talked to, whose son was there, I talked to the son and I talked to the father, and the son was there until 2 a.m, the night that they get beaten up, and then he went back to a friend's apartment to sleep, and he turns off his phone, and the father is hysterical, understandably. He's all the way in Ivano-Frankivsk. He keeps calling and calling. He doesn't know if his son is alive or what's happened or if he's in the hospital. The son's not answering the phone. He's calling his friends. He's calling the hospitals. Finally, Markian wakes up. He calls his father. He calls his mother. He calls his girlfriend. His father gets in the car. He drives all night. He goes to Kiev to find his son, but not to bring him home. He goes to Kiev to join him there. And one of the kids I talked to there, who was literally a kid, I mean, he was 16. He was 16. He was still living with his mother, as one does when they're 16. He wasn't even in college yet. He was in high school. And he was one of those kids who got battered by Berkut. And when I talked to him later in Kiev, I said, "Your mother must have been very upset, but she let you go back." And he said, "My mother was making Molotov cocktails on Hrushevskaya Street." And that was really when something turned. I mean, I think like arguably like that was, it raises the existential stakes, and I think it fundamentally changed the character of what was happening, because it's no longer just or even primarily, about this association agreement. Now it's really this impassioned revolt against this act of brutality, which became a symbol of proizvol, of this kind of arbitrariness and tyranny, of the sense that you are rendered a kind of helpless plaything of the powers that be, who can be as capricious and arbitrary and brutal as they like. And it really became this, they called themselves at that point then like the revolution of dignity. And this really was that kind of assertion of subjectivity, that we want to be treated as subjects, not as objects. And I think what Europe came to mean then was no longer the kind of empirical, highly imperfect instantiation of the European Union. It was really that like kind of eidetic, Platonic essence of Europe-ness. Europe as what it should be in a kind of ideal sense, as representing the rule of law and representing human dignity and representing human rights. And so the revolution, and this is, and I'm now going to kind of get to this idea about the modern and the postmodern, to enact a revolution this way. And it was the first time in all my years of hanging out in Eastern Europe, like a quarter century now, that I feel like I've seen a revolution in real time. That was not just a protest movement, that actually crossed that invisible boundary to become a revolution. And it implies to stake your life on values, implies that you believe that those values exist. To kind of, assert truth and subjectivity implies that you believe there is such a thing as self, and you believe that there is such a thing as truth, that you believe that there is such a thing as a kind of human subject worth fighting for. And I'll get back in a minute to why that is not as obvious as it might seem. The Maidan became a parallel polis. There's an old essay that some of you may remember that Václav Benda. Is Václav Benda. That was Benda from 79, maybe? 78, 79, 80, translated by Polofin? Yes. This is back from the days of Charter 77 and dissent in Czechoslovakia, that dissent as an existential attitude meant not just to oppose a government, it was not just a political position, it was the creation of a parallel alternative society. And in that alternative society, you should be able to live as if you were a free person, which means taking responsibility for yourself and for your action. And it was the Maidan was this extraordinary feat of self-organization and responsibility. It was incredibly elaborate infrastructure. There were communal kitchens, there was clothing distribution, there was an open university, there were film screenings, there were medical points. I mean, there was a whole parallel society. It was really a parallel polis. There were encounters with others that one never would have imagined oneself encountering. And maybe in questions we can talk about intersubjectivity and the solidarity of the shaken. There was this sense that the decisions you made were going to be self-defining in a way that one is not normally conscious of them being in everyday life. There was an understanding of something that I think East Europeans have maybe long understood and Americans generally don't, which is that there are moments in which there are no innocent choices. And Jay Bernstein is not here, but this is an understanding from Hegel that I'm taking largely from Jay, which is that, to actions not only occasionally, but more often than not have consequences far in excess of their intent. And so to act is to be guilty. The beautiful soul is innocent because she has not acted. But to act is to bear responsibility for what one has done, even though those consequences could not necessarily have been foreseen. And so the Maidan also becomes a space in which no choices are innocent. And one of the stories I tell in this book about a friend of Zhenya's, this very young guy named Misha, who's a student who's kind of thin, frail, and bookish, a graduate student in history. He was 22, maybe 23, And he's the only man in, a family of 3 generations of women. And the families with only women are a whole other, motif. There's just this beautiful novel by Jana Słoniowska came out on that topic about a family of 4 generations of women. But Misha's the only man in this family, and he lives with his grandmother and his mother and his 10-year-old sister. And the father has disappeared years ago, and he's out there in February during this massacre, and people are shooting at him, and he's aware he's probably going to. And his mother calls and pleads with him. And his grandmother calls and pleads with him to come home. And that, like, when I teach Sartre and existentialism to my undergraduates, like, that's the moment of existentialist choice, because there is no innocent decision. It's not clear what the right thing is to do. I mean, you believe that you have an obligation to stay and fight, because if not you and everybody together, then who? And if we don't fight, then we have given in, then we will live as slaves, then we will, but knowing that what happens to the mother and the grandmother and the little sister if they lose you? And this is a family who needs you. These people also need you. You also have obligations to them. So what does it mean to make the choice to stay in that kind of situation? So these moments of decision-making that became illuminated, I was very interested in this book. Like, what does it mean to make a choice? What does it mean that the experience of temporality changed? The experience of time started to talk about losing track. You can no longer remember nor in what order. The distinction between night and day becomes effaced. Suddenly you can call anyone at any time of day. Another thing that I became preoccupied with about my obsession with subjectivity and phenomenology was the relationship between subjectivity and transparency. One of the things that, all of us who have long been trying to understand totalitarianism have obsessed about is this distinction that, Hannah Arendt tells us about, right after the war, and everyone has been kind of grappling with since then, which is how totalitarianism effaces this boundary between the public and the private. And that at the end of a private space is kind of the end of the bourgeois individual. And then Jan Gross comes along and says, well, it was really the privatization of the public sphere, and that the boundary is effaced, but it's not because the private sphere disappears, but because there's a privatization of the public sphere. But in any case, the point is that transparency between realms has long been understood as a kind of characteristic. This striving for transparency. And I was sort of mesmerized by the Maidan of what it meant that because Yanukovych and the government, were controlling the mainstream media, in order to assert your own narrative against that, you turn to social media. The Maidan live streamed itself. What does it mean? Isaac watched the live streaming. What does it mean to set up cameras yourself so people can watch you being shot in real time? And I was one of those voyeurs watching people being shot, in real time. What does it mean that the precondition for the assertion of selfhood, for the assertion of your own narrative, is the self-violation of any kind of private space? Is the kind of the stealing from yourself of any kind of intimacy? What does it mean to turn the cameras on yourself? That dialectic of subjectivity and transparency, where that kind of the violation of selfhood becomes the precondition for the assertion of selfhood. I have not yet found an answer. That was something I felt like that question was kind of laid bare. What did that mean? And that when I was talking about this all to one of my friends in Poland, a Polish historian, during the Maidan, and he said, "Well, Marci, subjectivity. This is the last time I heard that word was during the days of Solidarity." Okay, so maybe I'll just say a couple more things briefly. So one of the things I was interested in, hey, David, in my phenomenology project that I got distracted by the Ukrainian Revolution was how this phenomenological tradition after 1968 takes a different path in Western Europe and a different path in Eastern Europe. Why, drawing on the same kind of Husserlian, Sartrean, Heideggerian references, do we get post-structuralism in France? And do we get a philosophy of dissent in Eastern Europe that, while rejecting grand narratives, insists that you not give up on truth? you have to believe there is something like a kind of ontological ability of truth. For Havel in the Power of the Powerless, to some extent, the ontological reality of truth is proven by contrast with the ontological reality of lies. But I'll just give you one reference as an example of this. So Leszek Kołakowski, after he is exiled from Poland after 1968, a couple years later comes to Yale and gives these lectures about Husserl. And in these lectures about Husserl, Kołakowski says, Husserl failed. His project of building a bridge from subject to object failed. As all such attempts at absolute truth and epistemological certainty are bound to fail because the problem of the bridge is insoluble. There is no magical passage. There's no magical passage from inside to outside, from consciousness to world, from immanence to transcendence. But Kołakowski says, and for me this really encapsulates Kołakowski, but even though we know you can never get there, you've got to bracket that knowledge and keep trying. Because you give up on truth and you have given up on ethics. You have to keep trying. The historian Ilya Gerasimov said, watching the Maidan, and he's like, wow, with the Maidan, the postmodern ended in Ukraine. So whether we consider this, the kind of modern before the postmodern or the overcoming of the postmodern, the Maidan was this moment, of asserting that there is such a thing as an ontological reality of truth, and there is such a thing as a real human subject. It's not just a kind of discursive that might slip through our fingers. And let me now, because Zhenya is here, and since I think this is a friendly space.
That's a surprise.
That's a surprise. No, Zhenya appears in this book, but I'm protective of exposing him to American audiences. Who knows what they might say? This is So, one of the things then I noticed that happened is that after the Maidan, nobody has a chance to breathe because suddenly, Putin annexes the Crimea, and then starts this war in the Donbass. And then you go from this moment of assertion of a modernist faith in truth and subjectivity without a grand narrative. Then you jump into the postmodern. You jump into post-truth, with a kind of depth that, I don't think they ever got to in France. They get to kind of post-truth in a way that I couldn't, in my imagination have imagined before I watched that happen. And that's really the moment when everything that is solid melts into air. And maybe I'll just tell one or two anecdotes. So my friend Katya, who was a graduate student in Donetsk, and one of the curators or organizers of this kind of discussion art space called Izolyatsiya. Their space, after the war starts, was taken over by the separatists and turned into a prison. And Katya and friends flee. She goes to Kiev, which is where I met her. And she's trying very calmly, to explain to me and narrate to me what was happening in Donetsk after this war starts, and trying to figure out who these different groups of people were and who was a local hoodlum, and who was a mercenary and who was a, Russian agent, and who was a Russian tourist, and who was acting on kind of authentically, ideological inclinations, and who was paid or who got wrapped up in the story that they had been told. And she says, and then Marci, then one day the Chechens come. And they don't even speak Russian very well. And they don't understand why they're getting, Ukrainian currency and not Russian currency from the bank machines. And then they call a meeting on Lenin Square. And this elderly, Russian Orthodox, Christian Orthodox woman comes to Lenin Square, and she gives an Orthodox christening to the Muslim soldier so that he will be victorious in battle against the Ukrainian Nazis. And we're sitting at this Japanese tea house deal in Kiev. And Katya's like, everything is surreal in this. You have the Christian woman on a communist square giving an Orthodox christening to a Muslim soldier so that he can go kill non-existent Ukrainian Nazis. Everything is fiction. And it's all happening to us. one of our graduate students now was working on a paper about the press, on a magazine or a newspaper called Novorossiya that was published by the separatists in the beginning of the war. And he was sending me some of these passages in Russian, and they are totally surreal. I mean, the nonsensical juxtapositions of the relationship of the Donetsk National Republic to Novorossiya and the Ruski Mir is going to be like the relationship of the young Soviet republics towards, the Communist International, and we are going to awaken everyone from their post-Soviet slumber and then ally with Latin America and ultimately liberate the Americans. And one kind of nonsensical thing after another in this kind of fantastical language. It's very hard to figure out what's going on. Serhiy Zhadan, this great Ukrainian poet, wrote a poem called Third Year into the War. And I'll just read you this stanza in Valzhina Mort's translation. And Serhiy writes, they buried him last winter. Same winter, too. Not a snowflake. So much rain. A quick funeral, we all have things to do. Which side was he fighting for, I asked. What a question, they say. One of the sides, who could figure them out? What difference does it make, they say? Same difference. Only he could have answered, they say. Now it's he said, she said. Could he? His corpse is missing a head. Okay, maybe just a word in conclusion, then I'm going to ask Shenya to talk a little bit about this transition to the war in the Donbass. So, as you probably know, there's a massacre in February 2014, after which Yanukovych flees across the border to Russia. Paul Manafort is then out of a job. We know what he does. Manafort, that I don't know. And I don't know that anybody knows. Don't know. But yeah, we do know that he he comes back to this side of the Atlantic. And as we see, the habit of civilization is fragile. And as Czesław Miłosz said, and at one point during Trump's campaign, when I was in a kind of state of despair, and I was talking to this young German friend I have, Stefan, who was raised by this Catholic family in Bavaria, and he's now both a student of theology and religious studies and a social activist. And I said, Stefan, how did your parents in this little village in Bavaria, how did they explain evil to you? Because I was trying to talk to my kids about Trump during the campaign. How do you explain that? How did they deal with the problem of evil? And Stefan says, well, they wouldn't have used, he's 23, 24. He said, well, they wouldn't have used this word, but it's a bit like Hannah Arendt talks about natality. The human capacity to create anew. The miracle that saves the world, is ultimately that same capacity that Hegel says for action, the consequences of which are always foreseen, which makes you guilty. That same capacity for action is also our capacity of natality, to begin anew, to begin something anew. And I think of that now, kind of inspired by Stefan. I also made all my undergraduates then read those chapters of The Human Condition where Arendt talks about natality, because it seemed to be the only bit of hope in dark times, in which I kept talking about how the habit of civilization is fragile. That the experience of revolution, this kind of what the Germans call a Grenzerfahrung or a Grenzsituation, like that border experience, what Karl Jasper said, the kind of the experience of being pushed to the limit that drives one to philosophy because there are no more answers. Those kinds of experiences function like Viktor Shklovsky described ostranienia, or estrangement, or defamiliarization. They kind of shake you. They wake you up. They cause you to see things with a kind of intensity you didn't see before. And as I was obsessing about this problem about subjectivity and temporality and what it meant to lose track of time and what the present came to mean during revolution, I then also subjected my poor undergraduates to a lot of philosophy of time. And we read Bergson, and we read Husserl, and we read Sartre. And Sartre grapples with the problem of the present, and he says, yes, for all of us, the present is a problem because it has no duration. You can't grab it. Every time you try to hold on to the present, it kind of slips through your fingers because at any given moment, it's always past or future. It's this kind of imperceptible punctuality. And Sartre says, but what the present is a border. It's the border between what he calls the en soi and the pour soi, the in itself and the for itself, facticity and transcendence. The present is the border between the in itself, between facticity, which is everything that has been done, everything that you have been up to this moment. And the realm of the for itself, the realm of transcendence, which is the possibility of something new. The possibility of going beyond what has been, what has happened, who you have been. And Sartre says the present is the moment of the crossing of the border. That is the present. And that border is with us all the time, but we generally don't notice it. And I thought what the experience of revolution did, that it kind of shakes us, into illuminating that border. Where suddenly that border, as the moment when you cross from the realm of facticity into the realm of transcendence, into the realm of going beyond what has been and you have been, it's like you suddenly cast a kind of glaring light on something that had always been half in shadow. And I'm unfortunately, not an idealist, and I don't believe in any happily ever afters. And God knows it's been kind of a disaster in Ukraine and a disaster in the United States and a disaster in Poland and basically a disaster anywhere. And I'm really a neurotic catastrophist. And I don't believe in God or a liberal teleology of progress or the end of history or any of those things. But I do believe in the pour soi. I do believe in that possibility of transcendence, not for some mystical other world, but because I think there are moments that prove to us that we can be shaken into a self-awareness of our possibility and therefore responsibility to go beyond. Okay, thank you.